I still remember the exact moment I realized I wasn't invited to Christmas. It wasn't a dramatic phone call or a heated argument. It was worse than that. It was silence. Complete, deliberate silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. November had rolled around, and my sister Rebecca was already posting pictures on social media of the family group chat where they were planning the holiday menu. Turkey or ham, mashed potatoes or sweet potato casserole. Who would bring the pies? I watched those messages pile up on her Instagram stories, screenshotted and shared with cute captions about family traditions. And I wasn't in that chat. I had never been added. My name is Emma Carter, and for 28 years, I've been the family disappointment. Not because I did anything terrible, not because I hurt anyone or made catastrophic choices, simply because I didn't become what they wanted me to become. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, expectations were everything. My father, Richard Carter, ran a successful dental practice downtown. My mother, Patricia, volunteered at the country club and organized charity galas. My older brother Daniel became a cardiovascular surgeon. Rebecca married a hedge fund manager and produced 2 perfect grandchildren before she turned 30. And then there was me, the odd one out, the one who couldn't quite fit into the mold they'd cast for our family. I studied creative writing in college. That was my first crime. My father sat me down during my sophomore year, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his disappointment palpable in the air between us. Richard said, "What exactly do you plan to do with an English degree, Emma?" Write the next great American novel while living in our basement? I told him I wanted to tell stories, to work in media, maybe journalism or content creation. Patricia chimed in from the doorway, her pearl necklace catching the afternoon light. She said content creation isn't a real career, sweetheart. It's what people do while they figure out their actual path. You're too smart for this nonsense. Why don't you consider law school or business? Daniel's wife is a pharmaceutical rep, and she does wonderfully. But I didn't want to be a pharmaceutical rep. I didn't want to sell anything except ideas, stories, the truth about the world as I saw it. So I graduated with my supposedly useless degree and moved to Atlanta, determined to prove them wrong. Those first few years were brutal. I worked as a barista at a coffee shop in Midtown, waking up at 4:30 in the morning to open, spending my afternoons pitching articles to online magazines and blogs for pennies per word. I lived in a studio apartment where the air conditioning barely worked in summer, and the heat was questionable in winter. My student loans felt like an anchor around my neck, dragging me deeper into water I couldn't see the bottom of. Every phone call home was an interrogation. Richard would ask, "So are you still making coffee for a living?" And I'd hear the judgment, the disappointment, the complete lack of faith in anything I was building. Rebecca would post pictures of her perfect life. Her husband Tyler with his strong jaw and his country club membership, her kids Charlotte and Mason in their private school uniforms, her kitchen renovations and her vacation to Turks and Caicos. Meanwhile, I was eating ramen noodles and trying to make $50 last until my next paycheck. The comparisons were constant. At family gatherings, which I still attended back then, the questions always found me. Patricia would say, "Rebecca just told us about Tyler's promotion. He's being considered for partner at his firm. How wonderful is that? Emma, dear, are you still at that coffee place?" Daniel would pat me on the shoulder with false sympathy. He'd say, "It's okay to take time figuring things out." Not everyone finds their path right away. Some people are late bloomers. I wasn't a late bloomer. I was working my tail off, just in a field they didn't respect or understand. Things started shifting when I got my first real freelance client. A small startup needed someone to manage their blog and social media. It paid $800 a month, which doesn't sound like much, but it was everything to me. It was validation. It was proof that someone valued my skills. From there, I taught myself everything I could about digital marketing, SEO, content strategy, analytics. I took every free course online. I read every article. I networked relentlessly, attending meetups and conferences even when I couldn't afford the ticket and had to volunteer just to get in the door. Slowly, painfully, my client list grew. 2 clients became 5. 5 became 10. I quit the coffee shop when I could finally afford to. I moved to a better apartment. I started turning down projects because I didn't have enough time, which felt like a miracle every single time it happened. But my family didn't see any of that. They saw what they wanted to see. When I told them I'd gone full-time freelance, Richard actually laughed. He said, "Freelance is just a fancy word for unemployed, Emma. You need stability, benefits, a retirement plan." What happens when you're 65 and you have nothing? I tried to explain that I was building something, that digital marketing was a growing field, that companies needed people like me. But Patricia just shook her head sadly, like I was a child who didn't understand how the real world worked. She said, "It's never too late to go back to school, honey. Get a teaching certificate, maybe. Teachers have good benefits." I stopped trying to make them understand. I stopped sharing my victories because they were always minimized. When I signed a retainer with a client for $3,000 a month, I celebrated alone in my apartment with cheap champagne. When I hired my first subcontractor to help with the workload, I didn't tell them because I knew they'd find something negative to say about it. The distance between us grew wider. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits home became shorter and more strained. I felt like an outsider at my own family's table, the black sheep who couldn't quite belong. Then came last Christmas, a year ago now. I made the drive to Charleston, bringing gifts I'd carefully selected and could finally afford. The house was decorated beautifully as always, with Patricia's signature white and gold theme. Everyone gathered in the living room with the massive tree twinkling in the corner. Daniel and his wife Karen were there with their teenage son. Rebecca and Tyler brought Charlotte and Mason, who'd grown so much since I'd last seen them. Everyone was drinking wine and laughing, sharing stories about their year. When it was my turn to share, I tried to keep it light. I mentioned I'd had a good year, that my business was growing. Tyler leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. He said, "Business? I thought you did freelance writing or something." I explained that I'd expanded into digital marketing strategy, that I was working with several companies now on their online presence and growth. Richard interrupted me. He said, "But you work from home, right? On your computer? That's not really a business, Emma. That's just, gig work." My face burned. I felt 14 years old again, being told my dreams were childish and unrealistic. Rebecca tried to soften it. She said, "I think what Dad means is that it's wonderful you're keeping busy, but don't you want something more permanent, more secure? Tyler has connections if you want an introduction to some real companies that are hiring. Real companies." As if the businesses I worked with weren't real. As if the value I provided wasn't legitimate. I left early that night, claiming I had a headache. I cried the whole drive back to Atlanta, feeling like a failure even though I knew, logically, that I wasn't. My bank account was healthy. My clients were happy. I was doing work I loved and getting paid well for it. But none of that mattered when my own family looked at me with pity and concern. After that Christmas, something changed in me. I stopped seeking their approval. I stopped hoping they'd be proud. I poured everything into my work, into growing and learning and becoming the best in my field. I rebranded my business. Instead of Emma Carter Freelance Writing, I became Carter Digital Solutions. I built a proper website. I hired 2 full-time employees and 3 contractors. I started speaking at marketing conferences, sharing strategies and case studies. My client list grew to include some impressive names, companies that were actually well known. And I did it all quietly, without announcing it to my family. What was the point? They'd already decided who I was and what my life amounted to. So when November came around this year and I wasn't invited to Christmas, part of me wasn't even surprised. I was the embarrassment, the one who didn't fit, the cautionary tale they probably told at the country club. Oh, our youngest? She does something with computers. We don't really understand it. Such a shame she didn't pursue something more substantial. The confirmation came in the most humiliating way possible. Rebecca called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice bright and cheerful. She said, "Hey Emma, just wanted to give you a heads up that Christmas is going to be kind of small this year. Just immediate family and Tyler's parents. Mom and Dad are keeping it intimate." I sat on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what she was actually saying. I asked, "Am I not immediate family?" There was a pause. Then Rebecca laughed, but it sounded forced. She said, "Well, you know what I mean. People with kids, mostly. Mom thought it would be easier with a smaller group, less chaos." "Daniel doesn't have young kids," I pointed out. "His son is 17. Another pause. Rebecca's voice got quieter. She said, "Look, Emma, you know how Mom and Dad are. They're worried about you. You're almost 30 and you're still doing the freelance thing and you don't have a boyfriend or any real roots, and I think it's just hard for them to watch. They love you, but maybe some distance this year would be good for everyone." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I asked her what she just said. Rebecca sighed. She said, "Don't make this a big thing. It's just one Christmas. You can do your own thing in Atlanta. Treat yourself to something nice. It doesn't have to be dramatic." But it was dramatic. It was my family telling me I wasn't welcome because I didn't meet their standards of success. Because I embarrassed them. Because there was no place for losers at the Carter family Christmas. I told Rebecca I understood and ended the call. Then I sat in the darkness of my apartment and let myself feel the full weight of the rejection. Here's what they didn't know. Here's what I hadn't told any of them, because I'd learned years ago that sharing my wins only led to them being dismissed or minimized. Carter Digital Solutions had just been acquired. A major marketing agency in New York had been watching my work for over a year. They'd reached out in September with an offer that made my head spin. They wanted to bring my company under their umbrella, keep me on as director of digital strategy for their entire operation, and pay me a salary that had 6 figures and started with a 2. The deal had closed 2 weeks before Rebecca's phone call. I was now a director at one of the most respected marketing agencies in the country. I had a team of 15 people reporting to me. I had stock options and a benefits package that included 4 weeks of vacation and a 401k match that would have made my father's head explode. But I was still the loser, still the disappointment, still not worth a seat at the Christmas table. The anger came later, after the hurt. It burned through me like wildfire. Who did they think they were? What gave them the right to decide my worth based on their narrow definition of success? I thought about sending a group text with a screenshot of my offer letter. I thought about calling my father and reading him the job description. I imagined their faces, the shock, the scrambling to justify their treatment of me. But that felt cheap. That felt like I was still seeking their validation, still trying to prove something to people who'd already made up their minds about who I was. The weeks following Rebecca's call were some of the strangest of my life. I was simultaneously experiencing the highest professional high of my career and the lowest personal low with my family. Every morning I'd wake up and check my phone, half expecting an apologetic text from my mother or an awkward call from my father saying there had been a misunderstanding. But nothing came. The silence was absolute. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into the transition with Whitmore and Associates with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. I spent hours on video calls with the New York team, learning their systems, understanding their culture, mapping out strategies for the accounts I'd be inheriting. My direct reports were mostly older than me, seasoned marketing professionals who'd been in the industry for 15 or 20 years. I could see the skepticism in their eyes during our first meetings. Who was this young woman from Atlanta who thought she could walk in and lead them? I didn't blame them for their doubt. I'd have felt the same way. So I made it my mission to earn their respect the old-fashioned way, by showing up prepared, by listening more than I talked, by asking smart questions and offering insights that demonstrated I knew what I was doing. There was this one guy, Stephen Matthews, who'd been with Whitmore for 12 years. He was in his mid-40s, had 2 kids in college, and clearly thought he should have gotten the director position instead of me. In our first one-on-one meeting, he barely made eye contact. When I asked him about the campaigns he was running, his answers were clipped and minimal. Stephen said, with all due respect, "I've been doing this a long time. I know how to run my accounts." I nodded and told him I could see that from his portfolio. Then I asked him what his biggest challenge was right now, what kept him up at night about his campaigns. He looked surprised by the question. After a moment, he admitted that he was struggling with a major client who wanted to expand into social commerce, but didn't want to invest in the infrastructure needed to do it right. They wanted results yesterday, but wouldn't commit the resources. I spent the next hour working through strategies with him. I shared a case study from a similar client I'd worked with in Atlanta, showed him the frameworks I'd developed for phased rollouts that could demonstrate value quickly without requiring massive upfront investment. By the end of the call, Stephen was actually engaged, asking questions, building on my ideas. He said, "Okay, that might actually work. I'll pitch it to them next week." That became my approach with the whole team. I didn't come in trying to prove I was the smartest person in the room. I came in trying to make everyone else better at their jobs. I listened, I supported, I shared what I knew and asked them to share what they knew. Slowly, incrementally, I won them over. But every victory at work was shadowed by the hollow ache of my family's rejection. I'd be in the middle of a successful strategy presentation and my phone would buzz with a text from Rebecca showing pictures of her kids making Christmas cookies with my mother. Or I'd close a major deal and want to call someone to celebrate, but the people I'd normally call, my family, were the ones who decided I wasn't worth including. My friend and business partner, Marcus Chen, told me to let it go when I ranted to him over drinks. He said, "Emma, you don't owe them anything. You've built an incredible career. You're about to step into a role that people work their entire lives to achieve. Who cares what your family thinks?" But I did care. That was the problem. No matter how much I tried to pretend I didn't, no matter how much distance I put between us, they were still my family. Their rejection still hurt in a way that professional success couldn't heal. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me over the rim of his beer glass. He said, "You know what I think? I think you're still waiting for them to see you. Really see you. And that's never going to happen until you stop caring whether they do or not." I asked him what that was supposed to mean. He set down his glass and looked at me seriously. He said, "You've spent your whole adult life trying to prove something to people who were never going to be impressed. Not because you weren't impressive, but because they'd already written your story in their heads. You were the flaky creative one, the dreamer who didn't understand the real world. And no amount of success was going to change that narrative, because it would mean admitting they were wrong about you from the beginning." His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I asked if he was saying I should just give up on my family entirely. Marcus shook his head. He said, "I'm saying you need to give up on the version of your family that exists in your head, the one that's going to suddenly realize your worth and apologize and be proud of you. That family doesn't exist. The real family you have is flawed and limited and maybe incapable of giving you what you need." Once you accept that, you can decide what kind of relationship you actually want with them, if any. I sat with that for a long time. The bar was getting crowded around us, the noise level rising as happy hour turned into evening. People were laughing, clinking glasses, celebrating the end of the work week, and I was sitting there feeling like a hole had been punched through my chest. The thing about Marcus was that he came from a similar background. His parents were Chinese immigrants who'd built a successful import-export business. They'd expected him to take over the family company. Instead, he'd gotten an MBA and gone into tech startups. His parents didn't speak to him for 2 years after he turned down their offer to join the business. Even now, their relationship was cordial but distant. So when Marcus talked about family expectations and disappointment, he knew what he was talking about. I asked him how he got past it, how he dealt with knowing his parents would never really understand or approve of his choices. Marcus smiled, but it was sad around the edges. He said, "I stopped trying to translate my life into terms they'd understand. I stopped seeking their validation, and I built a life I was proud of, surrounded by people who actually got me. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt sometimes, but the hurt is manageable when you're not constantly reopening the wound by seeking approval you're never going to get." We talked until the bar closed that night. About family and expectations and the ways we inherit trauma and judgment without even realizing it. About the courage it takes to disappoint the people who raised you. About the price of living authentically versus the price of living according to someone else's script. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not work stuff, just thoughts. A journal entry that turned into pages and pages of processing. I wrote about my childhood, about the subtle and not so subtle messages I'd internalized about success and worth. About the ways I'd twisted myself trying to be someone my parents could be proud of, even as I pursued a path they didn't respect. I wrote about the paradox of it all. How I'd simultaneously rebelled against their expectations by choosing creative writing, and yet spent years desperately seeking their approval for that choice. How I'd built an entire successful business partly out of spite to prove them wrong, which meant they still had power over my motivations and decisions. Marcus was right. I was still waiting for them to see me. And that waiting, that hoping, that constant low-level hunger for their recognition was poisoning my ability to fully enjoy my own success. The question was, how did I stop? How did I let go of a need that felt as fundamental as breathing? I didn't have an answer that night, but writing it all out helped. Getting it out of my head and onto the page where I could see it, examine it, start to understand the patterns that had shaped my life. Thanksgiving came and went. I spent it with friends in Atlanta, grateful for the chosen family that actually saw me and valued me. We cooked together, laughed together, and for a few hours, I forgot about the empty seat I wouldn't be filling in Charleston. Marcus hosted at his loft in the city. There were 8 of us total, a collection of friends who'd become family over the years. Sarah worked in nonprofit management and always had the best stories about the chaos of grant applications. Jennifer and her wife Amy ran a bakery together and brought 3 different pies. David was a software engineer who'd recently gone through his own family drama when he came out to his conservative parents. And then there was Natasha, my former coffee shop manager who'd become one of my closest friends. We went around the table sharing what we were grateful for. It was cheesy, maybe, but also kind of beautiful. Sarah talked about finally getting funding for a youth program she'd been developing for 2 years. Jennifer and Amy shared that their bakery had made it through the pandemic and was now thriving. David, his voice shaking a little, said he was grateful for friends who loved him exactly as he was. When it was my turn, I felt emotion welling up in my throat. I said I was grateful for this table, for these people, for the reminder that family isn't always about blood. That sometimes the people who see you most clearly are the ones you choose, not the ones you're born to. Natasha reached over and squeezed my hand. She knew what was happening with my biological family. We'd worked together during those brutal early years, and she'd been there for countless breakdown sessions in the coffee shop's storage room. After dinner, while we were cleaning up, Natasha pulled me aside. She said, "You okay?" Really? I told her I was figuring it out, that it hurt, but I was trying to see it as an opportunity for growth or whatever therapy speak made it feel less awful. Natasha laughed. She said, "Screw therapy speak. It's okay to just say it sucks. Your family is being terrible, and you're allowed to be angry and hurt and all the messy feelings. You don't have to spin it into a positive learning experience." That gave me permission I didn't know I needed. I admitted that I was furious. That some days I wanted to scream at them, to make them see how much they'd hurt me. That other days I just wanted to disappear, to build a life so far removed from them that their opinions couldn't touch me anymore. Natasha nodded. She said, "Both of those feelings are valid, and neither of them means you're handling this wrong. You're in the middle of it, Emma." Give yourself permission to not have it all figured out yet. We rejoined the others, and someone suggested playing cards. We spent the rest of the evening playing increasingly ridiculous games, drinking wine, and laughing until our sides hurt. It was exactly what I needed. A reminder that I wasn't alone, that I had people in my corner, that my worth wasn't determined by my parents' inability to see me. But driving home that night, the loneliness crept back in. I passed cars full of families heading home from their own Thanksgiving celebrations. I saw lights on in houses, imagining the warmth and connection inside. And I felt the absence of my own family like a physical ache. I called Rebecca when I got home. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping she'd realize how messed up this whole situation was. Maybe I wanted to hear her voice, to feel connected to someone who shared my history even if she didn't understand my present. She answered on the third ring, sounding harried. I could hear Charlotte and Mason arguing in the background about something. Rebecca said, "Emma, hey, can I call you back? We just got back from Mom and Dad's and the kids are wound up from all the sugar." I asked how Thanksgiving was. She sighed. She said, "You know, the usual. Mom went overboard on food as always. Dad complained about politics. Tyler and Daniel spent 3 hours talking about golf. It was fine." I waited for her to ask about my day, but she didn't. Instead, she said, "Look, I need to go deal with this situation before someone gets hurt. I'll talk to you later, okay?" And she hung up. Just like that. No inquiry about how I spent the holiday. No acknowledgement that I wasn't there. No recognition of the elephant we were both carefully avoiding. I sat on my couch in the dark apartment, phone still in my hand, and let myself cry. Really cry. The kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep and primal. I cried for the little girl who'd tried so hard to make her parents proud. I cried for the young woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion seeking their approval. I cried for the adult I'd become, successful and accomplished, still feeling like that wasn't enough. My phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "You good? Worried about you after you left." I texted back that I was okay, just processing. He replied, "Processing is code for crying alone in the dark. Want company?" I smiled despite the tears and told him I was fine, but thank you. Marcus sent back, "You're allowed to not be fine. You're allowed to be a mess about this. Just don't forget you're also a badass who built an empire from nothing. Both things can be true. Both things can be true." I held on to that like a lifeline. December arrived. My new position officially started, and the learning curve was steep but exhilarating. I was managing major accounts, leading strategy sessions with Fortune 500 companies, flying to New York twice a week for meetings. My calendar was packed. My brain was constantly buzzing with ideas and campaigns and growth strategies. The first week was overwhelming. Whitmore and Associates operated at a scale I'd never experienced before. My old company had maybe 20 active clients at any given time. Whitmore had hundreds. The budget for a single campaign often exceeded my entire annual revenue from the previous year. The expectations were sky high, and the margin for error was razor thin. I remember my first big presentation. It was for a luxury automotive brand that was trying to reach younger buyers without alienating their traditional customer base. The CMO was in the room, along with their entire marketing team, plus the Whitmore executives who'd hired me. 15 people, all watching me, all waiting to see if I could deliver. I'd prepared for 3 days straight. I knew that deck inside and out, had anticipated every possible question, had backup slides for scenarios I thought might come up, but standing in that conference room, looking at all those expectant faces, I felt my confidence waver. What if I wasn't ready for this? What if they'd made a mistake hiring me? What if I proved my parents right, that I was just a small-time freelancer playing in the big leagues? Then I remembered something Natasha had said to me years ago, back when I was terrified to pitch my first major client. She'd told me, "You belong anywhere you decide to belong." Confidence isn't about knowing you'll succeed. It's about knowing you'll figure it out even if you fail. So I took a breath, looked around that room, and started my presentation. I talked about demographic shifts and social media trends. I showed them data on luxury brand perception among millennials and Gen Z. I proposed a multi-channel strategy that would honor the brand's heritage while making it feel relevant and accessible to younger buyers. Halfway through, the CMO interrupted me. My heart stopped. This was it, the moment where they realized they'd made a terrible mistake. But then he smiled. He said, "This is exactly what we've been trying to articulate for months. You've nailed it. How quickly can we get started?" The relief was so intense I almost laughed. We spent the next hour diving into implementation details, timelines, and budget allocations. By the time the meeting ended, I had their approval to move forward and a handshake from the CMO that felt like an endorsement of everything I'd worked for. Walking out of that building into the December cold, I felt invincible. I'd done it. I'd proven I belonged here. I'd earned my seat at this table through skill and preparation and sheer determination. I wanted to call someone to share the victory. My fingers hovered over my phone, muscle memory almost dialing my mother's number before I remembered. She hadn't called in weeks. She'd written me off as the family failure. She wouldn't understand the significance of what had just happened, and even if I explained it, she'd probably find a way to minimize it or compare it to something Rebecca or Daniel had done. So I called Marcus instead. He whooped so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He said, "I told you. I knew you'd crush it. This calls for celebration. I'm taking you to dinner, and I'm not accepting no for an answer." We met at this upscale Italian place in Midtown. Over pasta and wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week, I told him about the presentation, about the CMO's reaction, about the rush of proving to myself that I could do this. Marcus raised his glass. He said, "To Emma Carter, Director of Digital Strategy and the most talented marketer I know, your family's loss is Whitmore's massive gain." I clinked my glass against his, but the mention of my family dimmed my mood a little. Marcus noticed immediately. He said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought them up. This is your night to celebrate." I told him it was okay, that they were always there in the back of my mind anyway. I admitted that part of me wished I could share this success with them, that they could be proud of me, that this could be the thing that finally made them see me differently. Marcus set down his glass. He said, "Emma, I'm going to say something and I need you to really hear me. You don't need them to validate this. You did something incredible today, and it doesn't matter if they know about it or care about it. The only person whose pride actually matters is you. Are you proud of yourself?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Was I proud? Or was my satisfaction still contingent on external validation, even if that validation now came from clients and colleagues instead of parents? I told Marcus I was working on it. on being proud of myself independent of anyone else's opinion, that it was harder than it should be, but I was trying. He nodded. He said, "That's all any of us can do. Keep trying. Keep showing up for ourselves even when nobody else does. And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Natasha's proud of you. Everyone at that Thanksgiving table is proud of you. You've got a whole cheering section, even if it's not the one you grew up wanting." The next few weeks were a blur of work and adaptation. I was learning the internal politics of a large agency, figuring out how to navigate relationships with colleagues who had competing interests and agendas. I was managing my team, trying to balance being supportive with being authoritative. I was working with clients who expected perfection and weren't shy about expressing disappointment when anything fell short. There were days when I missed the simplicity of my old freelance life, when it was just me and my laptop and clients who trusted me because I'd built relationships with them over time. Now, I was constantly proving myself, constantly performing, constantly aware that my reputation was being built or damaged with every interaction. Stephen, the team member who'd been skeptical of me at first, became one of my strongest allies. After I helped him land that social commerce strategy with his difficult client, he started coming to me with questions and ideas. He invited me to lunch one day, and over sandwiches, he told me something that stuck with me. Stephen said, "I was wrong about you. When they announced you as the new director, I thought it was typical corporate nonsense. Hire someone young and cheap who looks good in press releases but doesn't actually know what they're doing. But you're the real deal. You've earned my respect." I thanked him and asked what changed his mind. He said, "You listen, and you're not afraid to say when you don't know something. Most people at your level fake it, pretend they have all the answers. You're secure enough to admit when you need to learn. That's rare. That's why I think you're going to be great at this job." His words meant more than he probably realized. In an environment where I often felt like an imposter, having someone with his experience validate my approach was huge. But even as work got better, even as I found my footing and started to really thrive in my new role, the family situation haunted me. I'd see something funny and think about texting Rebecca. I'd have a question about taxes or insurance, and almost call my father for advice before remembering the distance between us. I'd pass a store window with toys that Charlotte and Mason would love and feel the ache of not being able to give them those gifts. And through it all, my phone stayed silent. No calls from Charleston, no texts asking how I was doing. The message was clear. I'd been written off, and they'd moved on without me. Then, 3 days before Christmas, my phone rang. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Patricia's voice was strange, higher pitched than normal. She said, "Emma, honey, hi. How are you?" "I'm fine," I replied, my voice flat. "Working." She laughed nervously. She said, "Yes, well, that's actually why I'm calling. Rebecca mentioned you might have gotten some kind of new job, with computers or marketing or something." I leaned back in my office chair, staring at the New York skyline through the window of my temporary office. I said, "Something like that." "Well," she continued, "your father ran into Thomas Hendricks at the club yesterday. You remember Thomas? He works in advertising in New York, and Thomas mentioned he'd heard through the grapevine about a young woman from Charleston who'd just been hired as a director at Whitmore and Associates. He said it was quite the coup for someone so young." Your father laughed it off, but then Thomas showed him the company's press release on his phone. I waited. I didn't say anything. Patricia's voice got smaller. She said, "Emma, why didn't you tell us? Why would I?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "You made it pretty clear what you think of my career, or lack thereof." There was silence on the other end. Then my mother cleared her throat. She said, "We had no idea you were doing so well. You never said anything. We thought you were still just freelancing from home." "I was doing well before this job," I told her. "You just didn't respect it. You didn't respect me." Patricia protested. She said, "That's not fair, Emma. We've always loved you. We just worried about your stability, your future. Parents worry. That's what we do." "No," I said, and my voice was steady now, calm even. "You judged. There's a difference. You decided that because my path didn't look like Daniel's or Rebecca's, it wasn't legitimate. You decided I was a failure worth excluding from Christmas because I embarrassed you, because there was no place for losers at your table." She gasped. She said, "Rebecca told you that? That's not— we never said that exactly. But you thought it. You meant it. Otherwise, why wouldn't I be invited this year?" Another long pause. Then Patricia said, "Your father wants to talk to you. He's very proud of your achievement. We both are. And we'd love for you to come for Christmas. There's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" I asked. "Or did my value suddenly increase because someone at your country club validated my career?" "Emma, please. We made a mistake. Let us make it right." I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to say yes, to go home, to have that moment where they finally saw me and appreciated me. Part of me wanted the apology, the recognition, the acceptance I'd been craving for so long. But another part of me, the part that had been slowly growing stronger over the years, knew that this wasn't real reconciliation. This was damage control. This was them realizing they'd miscalculated, that their disappointment of a daughter had actually become someone impressive by their standards. I told my mother I'd think about it and ended the call. Marcus found me later that afternoon, staring blankly at my computer screen. He asked if I was okay, and I told him about the phone call. He whistled low. He said, "So they want you back now that you've got the fancy title. Classic." I asked him what he thought I should do. Marcus sat on the edge of my desk. He said, "What do you want to do? Not what you think you should do, not what would make them happy. What does Emma want?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did I want? I thought about it over the next 24 hours. I thought about all the Christmases past, the subtle digs, the comparisons, the feeling of never being quite good enough. I thought about the years of building my business in the shadows, celebrated only by myself and my friends. I thought about Rebecca's phone call, telling me there was no place for me at their table. And then I thought about who I'd become. Not because of them, but despite them. I'd built a career I was proud of. I had friends who valued me. I had a future that excited me. I didn't need their validation anymore. But I also thought about forgiveness, about family, about the possibility that people can grow and change. Maybe this was their moment of realization. Maybe they genuinely wanted to repair our relationship. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift as cars passed outside my window. I kept replaying conversations in my head, imagining different scenarios for how Christmas could go. In one scenario, I showed up, and they were genuinely apologetic. They acknowledged how they'd hurt me, made real commitments to change, and we had a breakthrough moment that healed years of wounds. We became the family I'd always wanted us to be. In another scenario, I showed up and it was performative. They were nice because they were embarrassed that someone at the country club knew about my success. But underneath, nothing had really changed. They'd still see me as less than, still compare me to Daniel and Rebecca, still fail to understand or respect my choices. I'd leave feeling worse than if I hadn't gone at all. In a third scenario, I didn't go. I spent Christmas alone or with friends, proving to them and to myself that I didn't need their acceptance. But I'd always wonder what might have happened if I'd given them a chance. I'd carry that question with me, and it might grow into resentment or regret. I grabbed my phone and opened my notes app. I started making a list, because that's what I did when I couldn't think clearly. Pros and cons. Reasons to go and reasons to stay away. Reasons to go, they're my family. They might genuinely want to change. Charlotte and Mason deserve to have their aunt in their lives. I might regret not giving them a chance. Healing has to start somewhere. Holding on to anger hurts me more than them. Reasons not to go. They only reached out because of my job title. I don't owe them forgiveness just because they're family. Going might validate their behavior, and teach them that they can treat me badly without real consequences. I might be setting myself up for more hurt. I've built a good life without their approval, and going back might jeopardize that peace. The list didn't help. Every reason felt equally valid and equally incomplete. I got out of bed and made tea. It was 3 a.m, but sleep clearly wasn't happening. I sat by the window looking out at the quiet Atlanta streets, at the Christmas lights twinkling on a few buildings, at the empty sidewalks that would be bustling in a few hours. I thought about what Marcus had said, about giving up on the version of my family that existed in my head, the perfect family that would someday see me and appreciate me and be proud of me. That family didn't exist. It probably never had. The real family I had was flawed and limited and sometimes cruel in their limitations. But did that mean they were beyond redemption? Did one phone call prompted by external validation negate any possibility of genuine change? I picked up my phone again and scrolled through old photos. There was one from my high school graduation, all of us smiling in front of the magnolia tree in our backyard. I looked so hopeful in that picture, so certain that my future would include my family's support. I didn't know yet that choosing my own path would cost me their respect. There was another photo from Rebecca's wedding. I was a bridesmaid, wearing a dress I'd hated but smiled through anyway. Rebecca looked radiant. Our parents looked proud. Daniel gave a toast about family and tradition and how lucky we were to have each other. At the time, I'd felt the pressure of those words, the expectation that I would follow the same traditional path. But I'd also felt safe in the fold of family, certain that whatever I did, wherever I went, these people would be my foundation. When had that safety disappeared? Was it a single moment or a gradual erosion? I couldn't pinpoint it exactly. Maybe it was when I declared my major and saw the disappointment in my father's eyes. Maybe it was when I moved to Atlanta and my mother cried like I was abandoning them. Maybe it was last Christmas when Tyler suggested I needed real company connections, implying that everything I'd built on my own wasn't legitimate. Or maybe it was this November, when they excluded me from Christmas, and Rebecca delivered the message with barely concealed pity. When the subtext became text, "There's no place for losers at our table." My tea had gone cold. The sky was starting to lighten with the approaching dawn. I'd been sitting there for over an hour, lost in memories and hypotheticals. I called Natasha. It was early, but she was a baker, so she'd be awake. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Emma, what's wrong?" I told her everything. About the acquisition, about not being invited to Christmas, about my mother's call, about the impossible choice I was facing. Natasha listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I told her yes. She said, "If you go to Christmas and it goes badly, if they hurt you again or dismiss you or make you feel small, will you be okay? Do you have the emotional reserves to handle that?" I thought about it honestly. I said I didn't know, that I was already exhausted from work, from the transition, from carrying around the weight of their rejection. Natasha said, "Then maybe that's your answer. You don't owe them your presence when you're not sure you can handle their potential rejection, especially when they've done nothing to earn your trust back except make one phone call after they found out you have an impressive job title." I told her I was worried about regret, about always wondering what might have happened. She said, "Emma, you can always change your mind later. If you say no to Christmas this year, and then decide in a few months that you want to try rebuilding a relationship with them, you can do that. But if you go now when you're vulnerable and they hurt you again, that damage might be harder to undo. Sometimes protecting yourself isn't the same as holding a grudge. Sometimes it's just good boundaries." Her words settled something in me. I didn't have to make a grand gesture of forgiveness or a dramatic statement of cutting them off forever. I could make a decision based on what I needed right now, in this moment, with the understanding that I could make different decisions later. I thanked her and we talked for a while longer about recipes she was testing for the bakery and her wife's family drama. Normal life stuff that reminded me the world was bigger than my family situation. After we hung up, I felt clearer. Not certain, but clearer. My father called next. His voice was gruff, uncomfortable with emotions as always. Richard said, "Emma, your mother tells me you're upset about Christmas. I want you to know that wasn't personal. We just thought, well, we thought you'd be busy with your work or your friends. We didn't realize you'd want to come." I asked him directly. I said, "Dad, did you not invite me because you're embarrassed of what I do for a living?" There was a long pause. Then he said, "Not embarrassed, just concerned. You're my daughter. I want you to have security, stability, the kind of career that will take care of you long term. I didn't understand what you were building, but clearly you knew what you were doing." "Clearly," I repeated. "And if Thomas Hendricks hadn't mentioned my new job at the country club, would you still think I knew what I was doing?" He didn't have an answer for that. Another long silence stretched between us. I could hear him breathing, could picture him in his home office surrounded by his golf trophies and his framed degrees. He'd built a life that made sense to him, a life that fit neatly into the boxes society provided, and he'd expected his children to do the same. Finally, Richard said, "I'm not good at this, Emma. You know that. Your mother is the one who does the feelings and the conversations. I'm a dentist. I fix teeth. I understand problems that have clear solutions. But I don't know how to fix this." His vulnerability surprised me. In all my years, I'd never heard my father admit to not knowing something, to being uncertain or confused. I told him that maybe it didn't need to be fixed so much as acknowledged, that the hurt was real and would take time to heal, regardless of intentions or explanations. He asked what I needed from him. What would make it right? I thought about it. What did I need? An apology, yes, but more than that. I needed him to see that his concern for my stability had actually been judgment of my choices, that his love had been conditional on me meeting certain criteria, that he'd hurt me not through malice, but through inability or unwillingness to understand a path different from the one he'd imagined for me. I told him I needed to know that he respected me, not my job title, not my salary, not the external markers of success that people like Thomas Hendricks could recognize, but me. My intelligence, my work ethic, my choices, my life. Richard was quiet again. Then he said, "I do respect you. I know I haven't shown it well. But watching you these past years, even when I didn't understand what you were doing or why, I could see you were committed. You worked harder than anyone I know. That counts for something." It did count for something. But it didn't erase the years of dismissal, the comparisons to my siblings, the constant message that I was disappointing him. I asked him why he couldn't have said that before, why it took a press release and a colleague's comment for him to recognize my value. He sighed. He said, "Because I'm stubborn and I'm old and I thought I knew better. I thought I was protecting you from making a mistake." But you weren't making a mistake. You were building something I was too narrow-minded to see. It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd ever gotten from my father. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't undo the damage, but it was something. I told him I appreciated the call, but I needed more time to think. After we hung up, I felt emotionally wrung out. These conversations were exhausting in a way that work never was. At work, I knew the rules, understood the metrics for success, could strategize and problem solve. But with my family, everything was murky and complicated and layered with decades of history and hurt. I decided to go for a run. I needed to move, to get out of my head for a while. I put on my shoes and headphones and hit the streets of Atlanta. It was one of those perfect December days, cold and crisp but sunny. The city was decorated for Christmas, lights strung across buildings, wreaths on doors, trees visible through windows. As I ran, I thought about the different versions of myself I'd been throughout my life. The eager-to-please child who brought home straight A's hoping for her father's proud smile. The rebellious teenager who chose creative writing partly because she knew it would upset her parents. The struggling 20-something working 80-hour weeks to prove she could make it on her own. The successful entrepreneur who'd built something real and valuable but still felt invisible to the people who'd raised her. And now this version, the one who'd achieved external validation, but found it hollow when it didn't come with genuine understanding or respect from her family. Who was I without my family's approval? Who did I want to be? I ran for an hour, pushing myself harder than usual, until my legs burned and my lungs ached and my thoughts finally quieted. When I got back to my apartment, I felt clearer. Not decided, but clearer about what questions I needed to answer. I showered and made lunch, and while I was eating, Rebecca texted me. A long message about how she felt terrible, how she'd advocated for me to be included, how mom and dad were just old-fashioned and didn't understand modern careers. She said she was proud of me, that she'd always known I'd do something amazing. I stared at that message for a long time. Where was that pride over the last 5 years? Where was that support when I was struggling and scared and working 80-hour weeks to make my business work? She'd been too busy posting pictures of her perfect life to notice or care about mine. I typed and deleted several responses. Finally, I just sent back, "Thank you. I need some time to process everything." She replied immediately, "Of course. Take all the time you need. I love you." Did she? Or did she love the version of me that now had an impressive title and worked for a company people had heard of? I didn't know, and maybe that was the problem. I didn't trust that their love was unconditional anymore, if it ever had been. Daniel called too, of course, always the peacemaker. He said, "Sis, I know they messed up, but they're trying. They want you there." And honestly, Charlotte and Mason keep asking where Aunt Emma is. They miss you. That one hit harder. The kids. They were innocent in all of this. They didn't care about job titles or career paths. They just knew they loved their aunt. I asked Daniel if he understood why I was hurt. He sighed. He said, "Yeah, I do. Look, I'm not going to defend them. What they did was wrong. But they're our parents. They're flawed and stubborn, and sometimes they can't see past their own expectations, but they're also the only parents we've got. Is this really the hill you want to die on? Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't." I honestly didn't know. Daniel continued. He said, "I get that you're angry. You have every right to be. But holding on to that anger, refusing to even consider forgiving them, that's going to hurt you more than it hurts them. They'll still have Christmas with the rest of us. You'll be the one sitting alone in Atlanta wondering what if." I told him that was a low blow. He apologized. He said, "I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm just saying that forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about not letting their mistakes define your future. You've built an incredible life. You're successful beyond anything I think any of us expected. Don't let their small-mindedness take that away from you." I asked him when he'd become so wise. Daniel laughed. He said therapy. Karen insisted after my son hit his teenage years and started acting out. Best money I ever spent. You should consider it, by the way. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because a good therapist could help you work through this family stuff. We talked for almost an hour about family dynamics and expectations and the ways we all carry wounds from childhood. Daniel shared things I hadn't known about his own struggles with our parents' expectations. How the pressure to be the golden child, the surgeon, the perfect son, had nearly broken him during medical school. How he'd contemplated dropping out, changing careers, but couldn't face disappointing them. He said, "You were brave, Emma. You chose yourself even when it cost you their approval. I never had that courage. I did what they wanted and built a life that looks perfect from the outside but sometimes feels hollow. So, yeah, they treated you badly. But part of me wonders if they resented you a little for having the guts to disappoint them. That perspective hadn't occurred to me. I'd always thought of Daniel as the favorite, the one who'd gotten everything right. But maybe his path had its own costs, its own limitations. We ended the call with Daniel saying he hoped I'd come to Christmas, but would understand if I didn't. He said he loved me regardless of my decision, and that unlike our parents, his love and respect weren't conditional on my choices. That meant something. Having one family member who saw me clearly, who valued me for who I was rather than what I accomplished. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. The days leading up to Christmas were surreal. I was simultaneously dealing with major work projects and this impossible personal decision. At the office, I was confident and decisive. I led meetings, made strategic calls, guided my team through complex campaigns. But at night, alone in my apartment, I was a mess of conflicting emotions and paralyzed indecision. I made lists. I journaled. I talked to friends. I even tried meditating, though that mostly just meant sitting on my yoga mat feeling anxious for 20 minutes. Nothing gave me the clarity I was searching for. The truth was, there was no perfect answer. Every choice had consequences. Every path forward meant accepting some kind of loss or risk. If I went to Christmas, I risked being hurt again. I risked validating their behavior, teaching them that they could exclude me and then welcome me back when it suited them. I risked my own hard-won sense of self-worth by stepping back into a family dynamic that had always made me feel less than. But if I didn't go, I risked permanent damage to those relationships. I risked Charlotte and Mason growing up without really knowing their aunt. I risked the possibility, however small, that my parents were genuinely trying to change, and that my absence would foreclose that opportunity. I realized, somewhere in the middle of all this processing, that I'd been approaching the question wrong. I'd been trying to figure out what would lead to the best outcome, the happiest ending, the most healed relationship. But I couldn't control outcomes. I could only control my own choices and my own boundaries. The real question wasn't whether going to Christmas would fix things with my family. The real question was whether I could go to Christmas and still honor myself, still maintain the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish, still remember that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval. And that question, I could answer. Christmas Eve arrived. I'd been invited to 3 different gatherings with friends. I had options, good options, with people who actually wanted me there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at a crossroads, and the decision I made would shape more than just one holiday. I sat in my apartment, now decorated with a small tree I'd bought for myself, and I thought about what mattered, really mattered. My phone buzzed. A video call from Rebecca. I almost declined, but something made me answer. Charlotte's face filled the screen, her smile bright and missing one front tooth. She said, "Aunt Emma, Mommy said you might not come for Christmas. But I told her you have to come because I made you a present, and I can't mail it because it's too fragile." My heart squeezed. I asked her what she made. Charlotte held up a clay ornament, clearly made in some school art class. It was lumpy and painted in garish colors, but it had my name carefully etched into it. She said, "It's a heart because I love you, and it has your name so you never forget. Please come, Aunt Emma. Please?" Mason appeared next to her, 6 years old and earnest. He said, "Yeah, please come. Grandma makes the best cookies and we can play games, and I want to show you my new robot." Rebecca took the phone back, and I could see tears in her eyes. She said, "Emma, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. For not standing up for you more, for not seeing how hard you were working, for letting Mom and Dad make you feel less than. You're my sister and I love you, and I should have been better." Her voice cracked on the last words, and I felt my own resolve cracking too. I asked her if she really meant that, or if it was just about my new job title. Rebecca wiped her eyes. She said, "I've been a terrible sister. I was so caught up in my own life, in fitting the mold, in being what they wanted, that I didn't see what it was costing you. Or what it was costing me, honestly. I'm proud of you. Not because of your job title, though that's amazing, but because you were brave enough to do your own thing. I never had that courage. That surprised me. Rebecca had always seemed so confident, so secure in her choices. She continued. She said, I married Tyler because he checked all the boxes. Good family, good job, good prospects. But Emma, I don't even like him half the time. And I gave up my own career plans to be the perfect country club wife. I look at you and I see someone who chose herself, who built something from nothing, who didn't compromise. That takes guts I never had. We talked for over an hour. Really talked, maybe for the first time in years. She told me about the cracks in her perfect marriage, the therapy sessions, the moments when she wondered if she'd made the right choices. I told her about the lonely nights, the fear, the constant second-guessing, but also the pride and satisfaction of building something that was truly mine. By the end of the call, something had shifted between us. Not fixed exactly, but opened. A possibility of a real relationship, separate from our parents' expectations. I still hadn't decided about Christmas. But that conversation changed something in me. On Christmas morning, I woke up early. I made coffee and sat by my small tree, watching the sunrise paint the Atlanta skyline in shades of orange and pink. I thought about family, about forgiveness, about what we owe to the people who hurt us and what we owe to ourselves. The truth was complicated. My parents had failed me in significant ways. They'd minimized my achievements, dismissed my career, and excluded me from a major family holiday. Those weren't small things. Those were wounds that would take time to heal. But they were also human. Flawed and limited by their own perspectives and experiences. They'd been wrong, but they were trying, in their awkward and inadequate way, to make amends. I couldn't know if their change of heart was genuine, or if it would last beyond the shine of my new impressive job title. I couldn't know if they'd truly learned to respect my choices, or if this was just a temporary adjustment based on external validation. What I did know was that I'd spent years trying to earn their approval, and it had nearly broken me. I'd finally reached a place where I didn't need it anymore. My worth wasn't determined by their opinion. My success wasn't measured by their standards. And from that place of security, from that foundation of self-worth I'd built entirely on my own, I could make a choice about forgiveness that wasn't about them at all. It was about me, about the kind of person I wanted to be, about whether I wanted to carry the weight of this hurt or set it down. I picked up my phone and called my mother. Patricia answered on the first ring. She said, "Emma?" Her voice was hopeful and terrified all at once. I told her I'd come for Christmas, but I had conditions. She said, "Anything. Name it." I said I wasn't coming as the prodigal daughter who finally made good. I wasn't coming to be celebrated for my job title or paraded around as proof that I'd finally gotten my act together. I was coming as myself, the same person I'd been last year and the year before that. The person who'd been working hard and building something valuable even when they couldn't see it or respect it. I told her that if we were going to rebuild our relationship, it had to be based on mutual respect. That meant respecting my choices, my career, my life, even when it didn't look like what they'd planned for me. That meant no more comparisons to Daniel or Rebecca. No more subtle digs about stability or real jobs. No more judgment about my life being somehow less legitimate than theirs. I said that I loved them, but I wouldn't accept being treated as less than anymore. I'd worked too hard and come too far to shrink myself to fit into their expectations. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, those are fair terms. And Emma, I really am proud of you. Not just because of your new job, because you've always known who you were, even when we couldn't see it. That takes strength I don't think I've ever had." It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase years of hurt. But it was a start. I drove to Charleston that afternoon, The whole way, my stomach twisted with anxiety and anticipation. I didn't know what I'd find when I got there. I didn't know if this Christmas would be healing or just another disappointment. When I pulled up to my parents' house, the one I'd grown up in with its white columns and perfectly manicured lawn, I sat in my car for a minute. I reminded myself that I was enough, that I'd always been enough, that their approval or disapproval didn't change the fundamental truth of my worth. Then I grabbed my bag and walked to the door. Charlotte and Mason burst out before I could knock, launching themselves at me with shrieks of joy. I hugged them tight, breathing in their little kid smell of candy canes and excitement. My parents stood in the doorway. My father looked older than I remembered, more uncertain. My mother's eyes were red like she'd been crying. Richard stepped forward first. He said, "Emma, thank you for coming. I know we don't deserve it." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. I nodded and said, "Merry Christmas, Dad." Inside, the house was decorated as beautifully as always. The tree sparkled. The fireplace crackled. The smell of my mother's cooking filled the air. It was familiar and strange all at once. Dinner was awkward at first. Conversation felt forced, with everyone tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. But Charlotte and Mason, bless them, didn't care about adult tension. They chattered about school and friends and Christmas presents, filling the silence with their innocent joy. Slowly, the adults relaxed. Daniel told a funny story about his teenage son's first driving lesson. Rebecca shared a recipe disaster she'd had while trying to make Tyler's mother's famous pie. My mother fussed over everyone, making sure plates were full and glasses were topped off. And then, halfway through dinner, my father cleared his throat. He said, "Emma, I owe you an apology. A real one. Your mother and I, we've been thinking a lot about how we've treated you over the years. We were wrong. We let our own ideas about success and security blind us to what you were actually accomplishing. We made you feel like you weren't good enough, and that was our failure, not yours." The table went quiet. Everyone stared at their plates except me. I looked at my father, seeing the vulnerability in his face, the genuine regret. He continued. He said, "I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, when you were working those 80-hour weeks and building your business from nothing. That took guts and determination and intelligence. You didn't need a fancy job title for me to be proud. I should have seen that. I'm sorry I didn't." My throat tightened. I hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected him to be so direct, so honest. Patricia reached across the table and took my hand. She said, "We've been terrible parents in this regard. We pushed our dreams onto you instead of supporting yours. We compared you to your siblings instead of celebrating your unique path. We made you feel unwelcome in your own family. That stops now. Whether you're a director or a barista or anything else, you're our daughter and we love you. Period." I felt tears burning in my eyes. These were the words I'd needed to hear for so long. Not when I got the fancy job title, but years ago when I was struggling and scared. But maybe that was the thing about healing. It doesn't happen on our timeline. It happens when people are finally ready to see the truth. I told them I appreciated their apology, that it meant more than they knew. But I also told them that rebuilding trust would take time, that I needed to see consistent change, not just words on Christmas. Richard nodded. He said, "Fair enough. We'll prove it to you, however long it takes." After dinner, we moved to the living room for presents. Charlotte gave me the clay heart ornament, and I told her it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever received. Mason showed me his robot, and we spent 20 minutes making it do tricks while the other adults watched with amusement. Rebecca pulled me aside at one point. She said, "I meant what I said on the phone. I want to be a better sister. Can we try? Can we have a real relationship, separate from all the family drama?" I told her I'd like that. That I'd missed having a sister, a real one who saw me for who I was. Later, as the evening wound down and the kids got sleepy, I found myself sitting by the fireplace with my father. He was quiet for a long time, just staring at the flames. Then he said, "I don't understand what you do. Digital marketing, strategy, all of it. It's foreign to me. but I'm realizing that doesn't matter. You understand it. You're good at it. That's what counts. I smiled. I said, "You don't have to understand it, Dad. You just have to respect that it's real and valuable. That I'm real and valuable." He looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. He said, "You are. You always have been." I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Driving back to Atlanta the next morning, I felt different. Lighter, maybe. Not because everything was fixed or perfect. My family still had a long way to go in understanding and accepting me. There would be more missteps, more moments where old patterns emerged. Healing isn't linear, and family dynamics don't change overnight. But something fundamental had shifted. I'd stood up for myself. I'd set boundaries. I'd made it clear that their acceptance had to be unconditional, not based on external markers of success that met their approval. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that I didn't need their validation to know my worth. That was the real victory. Not the job title, not the impressive salary, not the moment when they realized they'd underestimated me. The real victory was the knowledge, bone deep and unshakable, that I was enough exactly as I was. Marcus called me that afternoon. He asked how Christmas went, and I told him everything. He laughed and said, "So they finally figured out you're a badass. Better late than never, I guess." I told him it wasn't really about that. It was about me figuring out that their opinion, while it mattered to me emotionally, didn't define my reality. I'd built an incredible career. I'd created value for dozens of companies. I'd employed people and helped them build their own careers. I'd done all of that without their support or approval. Marcus said that was the most growth mindset thing he'd ever heard me say. He said, "You know what? I think this whole mess might actually have been good for you. Painful, but good." He was right. Sometimes the hardest experiences are the ones that force us to find our own strength, to stop seeking external validation and start building internal confidence. My first day back at work after the holidays, I walked into the Manhattan office with my head high. I led a strategy meeting for a major client. I made decisions I was confident in. I earned my place at that table not because of my last name, or who my father was, or what country club my mother belonged to, but because I was damn good at what I did. And when I got home that night to my Atlanta apartment, I hung Charlotte's clay heart ornament on my tree. It wasn't perfect or professional or impressive by conventional standards, but it was made with love by someone who valued me for me. That was worth more than any fancy title or salary or approval from people who should have believed in me all along. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to my team. We had a big campaign launching in January, and I had ideas I wanted to share. As I typed, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The coffee shop mornings, the ramen dinners, the rejections and the small victories, the years of doubt and the moments of breakthrough. I thought about the girl I'd been, desperate for her family's approval, willing to shrink herself to fit into their mold. And I thought about the woman I'd become, someone who knew her worth regardless of external validation. My phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca with a picture of Charlotte wearing the matching bracelet I'd given her for Christmas. The message said, "She hasn't taken it off since yesterday. Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving us another chance." I smiled and texted back. Then I returned to my email, to my work, to the life I'd built on my own terms. The end of the year approached, and with it came reflection. I thought about what I'd learned in those painful months, about rejection and acceptance, about family and chosen family, about success and how we measure it. I realized that my parents' rejection, as much as it had hurt, had actually been a gift in disguise. It had forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I'd been seeking their approval for years, letting their opinion of me shape my own self-perception. Their rejection had been the final push I needed to break free from that pattern. I'd spent so much energy trying to prove myself to them, trying to make them see my value. But the truth was, I'd known my value all along. I'd just been waiting for them to confirm it. And in waiting for that confirmation, I'd given them power over my sense of self. When they excluded me from Christmas, when they made it clear that I didn't measure up to their standards, something inside me finally snapped free. I stopped waiting for their approval. I stopped measuring myself against their expectations. I started seeing myself through my own eyes, based on my own values and goals. And from that place of internal validation, I could offer them forgiveness without needing anything in return. I could rebuild a relationship with them not because I needed their approval, but because I chose to, on my own terms. New Year's Eve found me at a party with friends in Atlanta. At midnight, surrounded by people who loved and valued me, I made a resolution. Not to be more successful or make more money or achieve some external goal. Those things would come or they wouldn't, and either way, I'd be okay. My resolution was simpler and more profound: to never again let anyone else's opinion of me matter more than my own. To trust myself, to believe in my path even when others didn't understand it. To know deep in my bones that I was enough. As the countdown began and champagne glasses were raised, I thought about the year ahead. There would be challenges at work. There would be difficult conversations with my family as we navigated our new dynamic. There would be moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But I would face all of it from a place of strength I'd built myself. Not inherited, not granted by a job title or family approval, but earned through years of hard work and self-discovery. The clock struck midnight. People cheered and hugged and kissed. I raised my glass to the year that had broken me open and forced me to rebuild myself stronger. To the family that had rejected me and inadvertently given me the greatest gift, the knowledge that I didn't need their acceptance to be whole. My phone buzzed with messages, Happy New Year texts from colleagues and friends. And there, among them, a message from my father. Happy New Year, Emma. Proud of you. Always have been, even when I didn't show it well. Looking forward to seeing what you accomplish this year. I smiled and replied with a simple thank you, because that was enough. His pride was nice, but it wasn't necessary. I already knew my worth. As the party continued around me, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The Atlanta skyline glittered with lights, full of promise and possibility. I thought about all the people out there building their own paths, fighting their own battles, seeking their own definitions of success. I hoped they would learn what I'd learned, that the only approval that really matters is your own. That external validation is nice but not essential. That your worth is inherent, not earned. I hoped they would find the courage to disappoint the people who needed them to be someone they weren't, to trust their own vision even when others couldn't see it, to build something true to themselves, even if it didn't look like what others expected, because that's where real success lives. Not in job titles or salaries or family approval, but in the quiet knowledge that you've stayed true to yourself, that you've built a life that reflects your values, your passions, your unique vision of what matters. The next morning, January 1st, I woke up in my apartment with a slight hangover but a clear mind. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. I thought about the year ahead, about the projects I was excited to tackle, about the growth I wanted to pursue. But mostly, I thought about the journey I'd been on. From the girl who needed her parents' approval to survive, to the woman who'd learned to generate her own sense of worth. It had been painful and lonely at times, but it had also been necessary. I'd had to lose my family's acceptance to find my own. I'd had to be excluded to realize I was already complete. I'd had to face their judgment to learn that the only judgment that mattered was my own. And now, on the other side of that painful growth, I was free. Free to have a relationship with my family based on genuine connection rather than desperate need for approval. Free to pursue my career without the weight of their expectations. Free to define success on my own terms. My phone rang. Rebecca, asking if I wanted to bring the kids to Atlanta for a visit in a few weeks. She said they kept asking about when they'd see Aunt Emma again, and she thought it would be nice for us to spend time together outside the pressure of family gatherings. I told her I'd love that. We made plans, chatting easily about logistics and activities. It felt good, simple, real. After we hung up, I opened my laptop. I had work to do, strategies to develop, teams to lead. But first, I wrote an email to my younger self, the one who'd graduated college terrified and uncertain. I told her that the path ahead would be harder than she imagined, that she'd face rejection and doubt and loneliness, that the people she loved most wouldn't understand her choices or support her dreams, that there would be nights when she'd question everything, when she'd wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. But I also told her that she'd make it, that she'd build something incredible, that she'd discover strength she didn't know she had, that she'd become someone she was proud to be. I told her that the approval she was seeking from others was already inside her, waiting to be discovered, that the validation she needed would come from her own accomplishments, her own growth, her own choices, that she was enough, exactly as she was. I didn't send the email, of course. It was just for me, a reminder of how far I'd come. But writing it felt good, like closing a circle. As I got ready for the day, I thought about all the people out there who were where I'd been. The ones working jobs they loved but that didn't impress their families. The ones pursuing unconventional paths. The ones facing judgment and doubt from the people who were supposed to support them. I wanted to tell them to keep going, to trust themselves. To know that the opinions of others, even those we love, don't define our worth or our path. That sometimes the greatest gift is being forced to find your own approval, your own validation, your own sense of enough. The morning stretched ahead of me, full of possibility. I had meetings to prepare for, campaigns to strategize, a team to lead. I had a career I'd built from nothing, through years of doubt and struggle and determination. I had friends who valued me and a family that was learning to see me. But most importantly, I had myself. The woman who'd emerged from the fire of rejection and judgment stronger and more certain than before. The woman who knew her worth regardless of job titles or family approval or external validation. And that, I realized as I stepped out into the bright January morning, was the real success story. Not the fancy job or the impressive salary or the moment when my parents finally saw my value. The real success was the journey from seeking external approval to generating my own. From needing others to validate my choices to trusting my own judgment. From feeling like I had to prove my worth to knowing it was inherent. That was the transformation that mattered. That was the victory worth celebrating. And as I walked through the Atlanta streets toward the subway that would take me to my office, I carried that knowledge with me like armor. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever judgments or doubts or obstacles I'd face, I knew I could handle them. Because I'd learned the most important lesson of all, that the only person whose approval I truly needed was staring back at me in the mirror every morning, and she was finally, completely proud of who she'd become.